Dear students, I would like to welcome you to Lecture 10. It's about instruments and recommendations for action. I start with episode 1. It's about the context for instruments and recommendations for action towards low-carbon economy. And in the second block, then, we will talk about the 10 most important measures and bundles of initiative which we perceive as important and relevant for making low-carbon transformation possible. So let's kick directly into the context stuff. What I would like to discuss with you in terms of learning outputs is about two important things. On the one hand side, you will understand the international and systemic context for low-carbon transformation processes and initiatives, so the international framework we need to have in mind when we reflect on initiatives, instruments, and programs. And secondly, you will understand how that political instruments and policies can enable, not steer, the low-carbon process. This is very important because we would like to demonstrate that the low-carbon transformation is not something which we can produce made by good policies. We need to understand the whole context of societal change which then leads to low-carbon transformation. So this is what we are going to discuss during the first lecture. And I would like to start with this slide here. It's about population growth and technological development. And the most important thing is here that in our report, we argue that the low-carbon transformation is the third big great transformation in human mankind. And here on this slide, we see the first big transformations in human mankind. You can see the Neolithic revolutions, more or less 10,000 years ago. So human mankind invented agriculture and invented how to manage land resources, and you see then 200 years before the current situation, the Industrial Revolution, which started around 1800, 1810. And what this graph is demonstrating, it's a graph by an important North American economist. His name is Vogel. He got a Nobel Prize for his work on technological innovations which have huge impacts in the global economy. And what he is demonstrating here is the following. He shows that when you look at the Neolithic revolution, then towards the Industrial Revolution, we see big innovations in human mankind which had an enormous impact on human civilization. And these kind of innovations emerged in steps by 1,000 years. So you see here the invention of agriculture. This is the start of the Neolithic revolution. You see the emergence of cities. You see the emergence of mathematics and other big important human innovations in steps of 1,000 years. And then the Industrial Revolution starts to emerge. And what you can observe then is that the Industrial Revolution is actually an enormous acceleration of innovation processes. We have been seeing these 1,000-year steps in terms of innovation before, and then we do have innovations in a period and in an overturn of only several decades. So the Industrial Revolution is an acceleration of innovations. This is the second great transformation. Now we try to focus on the third great transformation. And what we need to do here are several things. On the one hand side, we need innovations now, and we need to accelerate those, but towards low-carbon transformation. We need innovations to make wealth creation within the planetary boundaries possible. So this is the first point. The second point is that the third big great transformation needs to be beyond technological innovations only. We also need institutional innovations. We also need reforms in the international system. So we need technological progress and innovation processes, but these need to be accompanied by societal innovations, institutional innovations. So this is the second important element, what needs to come up now in the third great transformation. And then there is a very important difference between the first great transformations, which we see here in this slide, and the third big transformation. And this third element is that this information now needs to be managed by human mankind. It needs to be managed by political actors. It needs to be managed by institutions. And this is what differentiated this process, the third big transformation, from the two other great transformations, because these transformations have been evolutions. This great transformation has to be managed, and this is what we are going to discuss afterwards. Which kind of instruments and which kind of institutions do we need to make this managed process towards the third great transformation, towards low-carbon development, possible? Here we see what we already have been discussing in another lecture. These are the three important areas where we need to focus our activities to make the great transformation happen. And of course, when we think about instruments and political initiatives, these three areas of transformation again are key. We need to go into the energy sector, we need to talk about urbanization, and we need to talk about land use. And when we afterwards discuss the different political initiatives and instruments, you will see that these areas will again appear, because these are the areas where we have to make the low carbon transformation possible. This is an important slide because it explains the political constellation in which we need to make the low carbon transformation. This slide shows that we are going currently through a massive change and a massive shift of power structures in the global economy. What you can see here is the relative size of the G7 countries, so these are the old industrialized countries, and the E7 economies, these are the emerging economies. In this case, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, Mexico, and Russia. And when you have a look on the left-hand side of this diagram, what you see is that currently still the G7 countries are the dominating force in the global economy. Their aggregated GDP is much higher than the E7 GDP in 2006. If you look then to the right-hand side of this diagram, you can see that in 2050, given current dynamics in industrialized countries and the emerging economies, it might be that the E7 economies are much bigger in terms of economic impact and in terms of their contribution to global GDP than the G7 economies. And this implies that we will see, or that we are currently in a process of massive economic and political power shift in the global economy. Why is this important for the great transformation? This is important for the great transformation for several reasons. One important reason is that we now can see on this slide that low carbon transformation is only possible if G7 countries, E7 countries make these kind of transformation processes in cooperation with each other. And we need to have these low carbon dynamics in the E7 and in the G7 countries. This is different, for example, from the situation 20 years ago. You might remember the Rio conference in 1992. The argument 20 years ago was that in the first phase of the transformation processes towards sustainability, the OECD world needs to make this kind of transformation processes, and then developing countries can learn from that. What we can see here is growth is moving forward now, mainly in non-OECD countries. So these non-OECD countries need to be movers and drivers of the low-carbon transformation too. There is a second element which is very important, which has to do with these power shifts in the global economy. From history, we know that these kind of tectonic power shifts very often have been producing conflicts in the global political system. Those of you who are interested might know Paul Kennedy's important book on the rise and emergency of new powers and old powers. So these kind of tectonic shifts very often have been translated in conflictive situations. So we need to have in mind that we have two very important shifts that we need to move in parallel. The low carbon transformation on the one hand side and managing these power shifts on the other hand side. In this diagram, I brought together these two important global waves of change. The low carbon transformation towards investing in a stable climate on the one hand side, and the power shift wave in one diagram. On the horizontal line, you see the climate issue. So you see on the right-hand side a process, a political economy process, which would be translated into a 2 degrees global warming process, which is a moderate global warming. This is what we are aiming at. On the left-hand side, in this horizontal platform of our diagram, you see dangerous climate change. The vertical line is demonstrating where we are moving to in terms of power shifts. On the top, you see a process in which we manage this power shift in a cooperative way. I argued that very often in the past we have seen conflictive dynamics which have been based on these huge tectonic power shifts. Now we have here on the top a process in which this is managed in a cooperative way. On the bottom you see a process which is translating into conflicts and which is translating into blockades in terms of international cooperation. So if you bring these two dimensions together, you are coming up with three different scenarios in terms of how the world order might look like in 2030, 2040 and even beyond. In the green field you see a situation in which we manage both dimensions well as human mankind. We manage well the power shift dimension, we translate it into cooperation, and we manage well at the same time the climate change challenge, so we translate the global economy into a low-carbon global economy. So the first scenario is international cooperation combined with a low-carbon transformation in the international economy. In this yellow field you see a different scenario. You see a scenario in which human mankind and the political powers, the emerging ones and the existing ones, the old powers, are able to organize cooperative dynamics between them. This would be a success. So political confrontation and conflict would be avoided. But on the other hand side, in this scenario, low carbon policies do not work. We move into a world where we see a global temperature rise 3 degrees Celsius or even higher than that. So the dynamics behind this second scenario might be that old powers and new powers might be able to manage the current financial crisis, which we do have directly in front of us. But they would fail in this scenario to manage in parallel to that the longer-term perspective crisis, or what political decision makers perceive as longer-term political challenges, and this is the climate change issue. So in this situation, we would have, for the next 20, 30 years or so, a more or less cooperative international political order, but we would move into dangerous climate change. And beyond 2030, 2040, what we predict is climate crises, and this climate crisis might be translated into political unstable situations. The German Advisory Council on Global Change, we produced a report on climate change as a security risk in 2008, 2009, where we demonstrated that dangerous climate change might result in political turbulences. So this would be the second scenario. The third scenario, the red one here, is that we would fail in both dimensions. We would fail in terms of managing the power transition peacefully, and we would fail in terms of organizing a low-carbon transition. So this would be a scenario in which we will see emerge, or we would see emerge, a turbulent and conflictive international political order, and we would run into climate crisis situations. The fourth scenario here on the right-hand side, on the bottom, is a scenario which is not relevant, because this scenario would imply that on the one hand side we would run into conflictive international political structures in the international arenas, but manage the international climate challenge well. This is from our perspective not realistic, because for managing the climate issue we need international cooperation. So conflictive international situations and solving the climate dilemma is from our perspective not possible. So if you look into these three scenarios, the question is how to organize policies which help us to go into this green scenario, which is not at all easy. In many discussions which I had where I presented this kind of scenarios, people argued that the most probable automatism that they see emerge is the yellow constellation. So we might be able to manage peacefully the power transition, but probably we will fail to manage in parallel to that the climate constellation. And this is what we reflected on in our report, because we need policies and initiatives to avoid the yellow and the red scenario here and to move into the green one. On this slide we do have the 5 good news and the 5 major challenges when it comes to the global low-carbon transformation. We already saw this slide in another lecture. And I'm discussing it here again because what is important to understand is that when it comes to instruments, initiatives and programs to make the low-carbon transformation possible, we need instruments and programs to foster the already favorable factors on the one hand side. You can see those here on the right-hand side of the diagram. And we need policies to make manageable the barriers towards a low-carbon transformation. This is what you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. So when it comes to the favorable factors, the policies, very briefly, which we will see afterwards when we discuss the 10 bundles for make the low carbon transformation possible. On the one hand side, it's about technology and innovation policies to foster low carbon technology processes. It's about how to finance and what kind of finance from the public side we need to foster and to leverage private investments in low carbon activities. It is about norms and values. We argued that we see a shift towards green, sustainability-oriented, low-carbon norms and values already in the global societies. Political parties can discuss this, but this is something which is already going beyond policies as such. This is about societal discourses. This is about the role of societies. It goes beyond political initiatives. We then argued that we need knowledge distributing systems for making low carbon knowledge as fast as possible available globally, and we will come back to this point. And we argued in terms of favorable conditions that we see many co-benefits towards low carbon development. It is about employment, it is about health, and when we organize our 10 bundles of instruments towards the low carbon transformation, we need to have these co-benefits in mind. We need to understand that low carbon transformation is not only about protecting the climate, it is at the same time employment policy and health policy. And this is important in terms of communicating our transformation policies. Then the difficult side, the barriers, the blockades, where we see that it is not at all easy to make the low carbon transformation happen. And if you go through this list, you will get a feeling for where the major initiatives need to make progress. We have been talking about these path dependencies, technological path dependencies, political path dependencies, power blockades. We will come back to this point when we discuss the concrete instruments. This is on the one hand side about technological policies opening new trajectories. It is about demonstration projects, for example, for the energy transformation, which make visible for people that we can overcome these kind of path dependencies, which are so strong in our economies. When it comes then to the second important barrier here, the tight framework, it is about the question how to accelerate political processes and economic processes. We do not need only policies which make, in general, low-carbon transformation processes possible. We are working under time pressure. So we need instruments which scale up. We need instruments which accelerate processes in time. We will then come back, as you will see, to the urbanization issue, which is one of the other barriers here on this slide. And we need to come back of how to make energy transformation processes rapid, accelerating, and making renewable energies cheap in a short period of time, because we know that we do have cheap coal available. And to manage this kind of barrier, energy policies are necessary to make more cost-efficient energy processes towards creating a renewable energy base for the global economy. So managing these barriers and fostering the already positive trends towards low-carbon transformation, this is what policy programs are about when it comes to make the low-carbon transformation possible. This is a slide which is focusing on the major arenas of change towards low-carbon transformation processes, which we also already saw in another lecture. It's about a growing number of actors in many areas of our economies and of our society which are moving towards low carbon. It's about shifting norms and values, which we already discussed. It's about green innovation processes, it's about international cooperation, and it is about reorganizing the policy regimes to foster low-carbon transformation processes. The main point which I would like to make here is that, having in mind these areas of change, it becomes clear that we cannot manage the low-carbon transformation based on policies only. Because if you look in the shifting norms and value arena of change, this is something where many actors need to make contributions to that. Science is making contributions to that. Researchers try to demonstrate how good societies based on planetary boundaries might look like. Philosophers might make contributions to this kind of shifts. Churches are making contributions. Non-governmental organizations are making contributions. There are no policies to produce shifts and norms and values which we need to make the low-carbon transformation possible. So it is important to argue that we are in front of a societal shift in many dimensions of our economies and societies, and policy regime shifts and political instruments can help to foster several of these dynamic processes in these different areas where low-carbon transformation processes are moving forward. But policies and right policies cannot produce the low-carbon transformation. This is about an effort of the societies as a whole. And I would like to finish this argument with this slide here, where we have the following argument in mind. What we do have in mind is when we see these arenas of change, the new narratives, the actors, the innovation processes, the policy regime, the international political context, and the shifting norms of values, we see three mechanisms which are then producing low-carbon transformation dynamics. We see and argue that there are transformational policies which can foster policy transformation processes in these 6 areas of change, and we will discuss those transformational policies afterwards. But we also argue that, and maybe the most important element of change here is co-evolution. So here are dynamics in these 6 arenas of change, and these are interacting between these different levels. So we have processes of mutual reinforcement. For example, if norms and values are changing towards low-carbon perspectives, towards sustainability, this makes policy reforms for policymakers much easier and can therefore foster policy reforms. If in the area of international cooperation we see that in several countries worldwide we do have successful low-carbon transformation processes, this helps actors in other countries and even in other sectors to move forward also. If innovations are making reforms in the energy sector more feasible in terms of cost structures, this also helps to make policy reforms more powerful and to accelerate policy reforms. So the co-evolution process is the most powerful mechanism which bring forward low-carbon transformations. And what we argued last time in the lecture about how transformation processes emerge and make progress, what we argued is that the elements are already there on these 6 arenas of change, and the interaction between those are accelerating the process even more. And the question is how transformational policies can help to enable a context in which this kind of process can emerge even faster. But co-evolution, self-organization, and the internal dynamics within our economies and societies, this is the most powerful machine towards low-carbon transformation processes. We then have a third element here. We call this the social contract. Social contract implies that, and we have been learning here from important thinkers like Immanuel Kant or Rousseau and John Locke, and those have been arguing that if it comes to big transformations in our society, imagine or remember the transformation towards democratic societies, imagine the transformation towards overcoming apartheid in South Africa. If you make these kind of big shifts in societies, what you need in these societies themselves is a social contract about these changes. If you really would like to change basic structures in our societies, people need to be convinced that these changes make sense. We call this a social contract. So a social contract is something which goes also beyond political instruments in a more narrow sense, because social contract implies that many people participate in societal discourses, and the result of these discourses is that the perception of what is good policy and the reception of what is an acceptable economy are changing. So what I wanted to make clear in this first lecture, talking about the context for policies with these last slides, was that normally we as political advisors make a definition of what the problem is about. And then we figure out 2 or 3 different options and alternatives of policy packages. And then we argue that go for these policies and you will solve the problem. And this time it's different because we go much further. We argue that transformational policies are very important. But to make the low-carbon transformation possible, you need these broader societal changes. Policies are only a part of that. Other political actors, other economic actors, making these dynamics in the different arenas of change which you see here are as important as politics. So we cannot steer the low-carbon transformation. We cannot produce the low-carbon transformation. It's not only a question of policies, institutions and right instruments. It's a societal process. And the question is which kind of policies help to enable a framework which can make this global low-carbon transformation easier for the actors involved. So this is already the end of the first episode of this lecture. We have been talking about important elements which form the part, or which form the context in which policies can make a difference. And I have some exercises for your self-study, and I have some issues which you might discuss with your colleagues. You might have an interest to discuss which international political processes are most relevant for low-carbon policies and initiatives. We have been talking that not only low carbon is a big issue, we have been seeing that international politics and power shifts are important. So how are these different political dynamics in the international arenas actually interfering? And what is promoting low-carbon transformation processes and what makes low-carbon transformation processes more difficult? You also might discuss the limits of political initiatives to make the low-carbon transformation possible when you differentiate between what political initiatives can really make in terms of accelerate the low-carbon transformation processes and where other kinds of dynamics in our economies and societies are key. So where are the limits of political initiatives? We also have another third element here which discusses the acceleration of techno-physical evolutionary processes. So discuss within your groups the differences between the first, the second, and now the third big transformation in human mankind. Try to understand and figure out what this great transformation towards the low-carbon society and the global low-carbon economy, where the differences are between this great transformation and the 2 other ones, which we already know from history. What can we learn from history to make this low-carbon transformation possible? And the last slide is about power. Power shifts are emerging. Power in terms of economic initiatives and in terms of economic drive in the global economy are shifting, and discuss the role of G7 and the role of E7 in this context, and try to make up your mind in terms of the role of the G20, because we saw that after the financial crisis in 2008, G20 have been becoming a major driver of international economics. What is the role, from your perspective, for G20 in the low-carbon transformation process? So, dear students, I hope this was helpful to understand the context in which the policies for the low-carbon transformation is taking place. I hope you remember the major outcomes which I wanted to discuss with you. And the major outcomes has been to understand the different political dynamics in the international arena which are moving forward on the one hand side, and on the other hand side, the specific characteristics of the low-carbon transformation as such. Because if we don't have in mind these 2 dimensions, we cannot understand easily which kind of policies are necessary to make the shift possible. I hope we will see us again in episode 2.